Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to look at the 1993 film adaptation of one of my favorite classical books. This is The Secret Garden. So this is my copy. Had it for several years. I enjoy this film, but it has its issues, particularly since I reread the book. So let's go over the basic plot of the film. So in this film, you have a little girl by the name of Mary. Her name is Mary Lennox. It starts off with an overture of her being dressed, basically. Her parents didn't want anything to do with her. Her father was always busy with his job with the military, and her mother did nothing but want to go to parties and basically ignored Mary completely. So it shows her being dressed by her servants who did whatever she wanted. She was bored, it was hot. It then shows her having a fight with her mother, wanting to spend time with her mother or go to this party. It's a voiceover. And then she goes in her mother's room after she's watching out the window at this big party with elephants and all sorts of things. And then she's playing with her mother's elephant and hides under all of a sudden she hears her mother coming. She goes, hides under her mother's bed. And her mother grabbing her fan, and the next minute there's a massive earthquake, and her parents die. And so the next thing you know, she's with a bunch of other orphans, and you're hearing how she didn't even cry when her parents died. She's getting off the ship in England. It's cold, it's wet, it's England. And essentially she has a name on her, a number on her clothing, and they call out various numbers to have children be picked up. And they call out her number, and nobody shows up. And she's told to wait aside. And a bunch of other children, all the other kids go by, it's completely empty, and a woman by the name of Miss Medlock comes and picks her up. And basically she'd been abandoned there at the boat station. So Medlock takes her to Misselthwaite Manor, which is the home of her uncle Archibald Craven. And she's shown to a room and left there. And the next morning, a young maid by the name of Martha shows up, helps her get dressed, kind of makes fun. It's like, you're 9 years old. You can't get dressed by yourself. And she has to show her how to get dressed. And slowly Mary adapts to being in England, and particularly in Yorkshire, where she's, again, different from England, or different from India. She's pretty much left to her own devices, only there's nobody really for her to tell what to do, and nobody's obeying her or anything. So she literally has to take care of herself mostly. She's brought food and clothing. Her room is cleaned up for her. But again, she's alone. So she goes wandering the garden. She hears these stories about this garden that was locked up. And eventually she finds the key. And she's able to open up this garden. And Martha eventually talks about her brother, Dickon. Eventually she meets Dickon, and Mary trusts him to show him this garden. And then she asks her uncle, who she sees all of once, and very much asks for a piece of earth. And he's like, fine. And then he proceeds to leave town, which he does frequently. He's not there all that often. And so she's starting to change, and she becomes close to Dickon, who talks with a lot of the animals on the moors. He rides a little moor pony. They become friends. She learns to be a nice person. She hadn't done that before. And she's starting to become happier. But however, at night she hears a crying sound. Whenever she asks about it, both Mrs. Medlock and Martha said, you're not hearing anything, it's just the wind. Well, one day she goes wandering around at night. Yeah, it's not the wind. It's her cousin, Colin. They're the same age. So their mothers were twin sisters. And he thinks he has a bump on his back and he can't walk, and he's pretty much the male equivalent of her when she was back in India, because everybody does what she says, only they do a bunch of medical stuff on him because supposedly he has a hump on his back. And the doctors and the nurse pretty much are kind of controlling him to an extent. Oh, he's also a bit of a spoiled brat. And eventually, they become friends. She doesn't give him what he wants. Hindley, she doesn't have to. She's not his servant. She's his cousin. So they kind of try, but Mary's like, I'm not gonna obey him. Forget it. I don't care. You can drag me here, but I'm not gonna obey him because she's of the same social class he is. So they really cannot force her because she's a ward. She's not a servant. She's not beneath them. So the only person who can probably order her around would be her uncle. So they actually become friends. And eventually she convinces Colin to allow Dickon to come visit him, to embrace sunlight, and to eventually go outside. And they eventually go to the garden. And he's inspired by the garden. And it's his mother's garden. And they meet Ben Witherspot, who's a gardener. And he's been tending the gardens. And he had promised Colin's mother that he would tend to her roses. This is a rose garden. It has a lot of other flowers, but it was primarily a rose garden. And then basically Colin he's egged on by Witherspot, who pretty much calls him a cripple. And so he decides to try it instead. And he can for a few seconds. And that's when he realizes now Mary's felt his back and said, you do not have a lump. You just are very skinny. And just knock it off. I do not believe you do not have a lump. There is nothing wrong with you. You're just very skinny because you don't eat and you're pathetic. And yes, she's told him off multiple times because she's not having any of it. Remember, she was just like him and she knows this. So he's inspired by the garden and by the magic of the garden and says, I'm going to learn to walk. And so he starts trying. He starts getting up and he starts walking. They start eating a little bit more. And the people back at the house, because he swears, the gardener, do not tell anybody. Mary's not going to tell anybody. Dickon's certainly not going to tell anybody. And so back at the house, they think there's something wrong with him. And they do medical procedures, and he's getting pissed off because he knows he's just getting stronger because he's walking. They think he's flushed and feverish, and they try to control him and try to keep him in the house and try to keep Mary away. He throws a fit. And it's very much, you see the medical medical procedures where they're dunking him in water and wrapping his legs up. And basically, it does seem like they're torturing him and they're putting electricity on his legs because they think they're swollen. When in fact, he's gaining weight and he's walking, so they're gaining muscle mass because he's not an invalid anymore. But eventually, I don't know whether they stop or something, but eventually he's walking, he's happy. Back, they don't actually specify where his father has gone off to. His father's just gone. He's at some hotel somewhere. And his father starts having dreams about his wife, basically calling him home. And so he eventually comes home. He comes to the house. He's like, where is Colin? And they're like, we don't know. He should be. Basically, they had gotten a huge fight, locked Mary in her room. And her and Colin, I think, had escaped. By this time, he's fine. He's walking like any other boy. He's walking, he's running, he's fine. But, of course, the servants don't know this. They think there's something wrong. They think Mary's evil because she's inspiring him to change. And Mrs. Medlock, who had locked her in her room. Of course, the children don't do this. The children know how to escape. This is an old house. There's a lot of secret passages. They've found them already because periodically it's England. It rains. So when they can't go out to the garden, they wander around the house. So they've figured a whole bunch of stuff out. They've seen pictures of Colin's mother. They've seen relics of India, which may have been sent to her by Mary's mother, which I don't think you ever hear the name of. And so by the time, Craven shows up. Where is he? Where's the girl? Medlock is saying she's evil. We've locked her in her room. And she unlocks the door, and Mary's purse is not there. And where is Colin? It's like, we don't know. It's like she's bewitched him. You have to send her away. And Martha comes up. It's like, they might be in the garden. And he goes outside. And he gets near the entrance, and they're playing blind man's bluff. They're outside. So Colin is blindfolded, and he's searching for Mary and Dickon, and they're laughing. and they're having fun, and his father approaches, and Colin runs into him, and he takes off his blindfold, realizes he's staring at his dad. It's like, I can walk. I'm fine. And he hugs his son. And they go into the garden, and they talk. And Mary then feels like she's alone again, because Colin has his father. And she kind of goes out and sits on the edge of the moor and starts crying. And her uncle approaches. He's like, what's wrong? He's like, I'm alone again. And he's like, no, you're not. And he hugs her. And he smiles. And she learns to cry. And he laughs. And then they go back to the house. And servants basically, Witherspot is there. He's like, you need to look out the window. And it's like, where are they? Because he'd come up. It's like, they're coming. And you see Colin walking perfectly fine, perfectly straight, with his father and with Mary at his side. And the last is the overture of, it looks like an adult woman. You only see like the hand and the back of them talking in the overture that you had heard previously, that Mary, she learned to cry, her uncle learned to laugh, and the garden is always open, awake, and alive. So that is the film. So a couple of things that are different. One of the major things, and they always seem to make this weird, strange change, which makes no sense in the context of things. The relationship between Mary and Colin is a relationship, they are in fact cousins, but Mary's father and Lilith, which is Colin's mother, were siblings. There was no twin thing going on between the mothers. The other thing that happens in the beginning is a little different. One, Mary's parents die of cholera, not an earthquake. It would be very, very strange for them to die in an earthquake in India. I don't know if there was earthquakes like that in India. There can be, but again, her parents die of cholera. And what happens in the book is she wakes up one day, her nurse is not there. Somebody else is there to dress her, and she wants her nurse, and her nurse can't come. And then she's out in the garden playing by herself, and her mother comes out with a young officer. They talk about the cholera. Her mother mentions that she wanted to go to this party, otherwise they would have left a week before. And then they go, basically, you hear her crying, and Mary finds out that her nurse had died. Her mother hadn't realized that the cholera had broken out amongst their servants. And basically, Mary goes back to her room the next day. Basically, she's dressed and then left alone. And things are kind of crazy. And she goes out. She sneaks out of the nursery at some point, finds a hastily abandoned dinner, eats, drinks a glass of wine, goes back to her room and falls asleep. And when she wakes up, the house is deadly silent. She thinks the cholera is over. Nope, parents are dead. Most of the servants are dead. Those who aren't, pretty much vamoosed and ran away. And two soldiers, particularly a young one, come to the house and realize there's a little girl here, left alone. And then, rather than, obviously, her parents have died of cholera, she's not with a bunch of orphans. She's sent over on a ship with a woman and her 2 children, an officer's wife and her 2 children, who she's taking to go to boarding school in England. And Medlock is not late picking her up. Medlock is there when they get off the ship, takes Mary, takes her back to Witherspot. The other major thing, and for some reason they have to insert this into the film, Mrs. Medlock, Dr. Craven, which is technically Lord Craven's cousin and Colin's medical officer, basically medical doctor, and the nurse are not evil. Nor do they particularly care much about Mary being there. In fact, the nurse, one, doesn't care whether Colin lives or dies. It's like, this is a job, he's irritating, I do what I'm supposed to. If he dies, I don't care. He's perfectly fine. She knows they'd had a doctor down from London before, and they used to have him in a back brace, and the doctor from London was like, there is not a damn thing wrong with this kid except for he's a spoiled little brat. He needs to be spending more time outside and not being basically waited on hands and foot. He's fine. He's just a spoiled little brat. So Medlock and the doctor know there's absolutely nothing wrong with him. That he's just, and they can't control him. And they can't do anything because they're servants and their job is just to look after him and do what he says. The only person who actually has any control whatsoever over him is his father. And his father is depressed because he lost his wife in childbirth and he's never there. So, yeah. So that's the major difference. They don't do any medical procedures on him. They think he's getting a little flush, but he denies it, and that's when he spends time outside. There's no locking Mary in her room. In fact, the nurse thinks she's a good thing. She makes a comment that that it's good for him to have somebody who is not going to obey his every whim. Because she stands up to him. It's like, he has a sister like you, he'd be fine. And essentially that's what happens, because Mary does not give a damn. She will come and go as she so pleases. And Colin part of that, his growth is, he figures out he has to be a nice person. He also meets Dick and realizes he has to be a nice person because they're not his servants. They do not have to have anything to do with him if they don't want to. And Mary literally, like, you can't, he at one point in time in the book says, I can have them dry here. She's like, you most certainly can, but they cannot make me speak. They can't even make me look at you. I'll look at the ground. So, yeah, he realizes he can't be his spoiled little bratty self. And she also realizes how she was. She's not oblivious to the fact that she was a miserable person. And she grows, and she talks to Colin about this. And they go outside. The other person they completely cut out of the film is Dickens' mother, who plays an important role in the book. One, she brings them food when they have to start turning food away because they're hiding the fact that Colin is getting healthier and she's not getting depressed. So she brings them food. And she's very much in on the secret. She knows what's going on. She went to school with Mrs. Medlock. She's Dickon and Martha's mother. And they're hiding this because they know what's going on. She actually writes. She'd approached Mr. Craven on the road once to talk to him about Mary and to encourage him to help her and to, acknowledge that he has a niece. But she also writes him a letter once she knows that Colin can walk, encouraging him to come home. And the film shows it a little bit more dramatically, but he does start having dreams about his wife. And he starts thinking that maybe he should come home and spend some time with his son. So, and that letter just kind of was the thing that gave him that final push to go home. And he's in the Netherlands in the book. That's specifically, they specify where the heck he's at. He's in the Netherlands. So he does kind of have the dreamy things, but he also gets this letter from Martha and Dickens' mother encouraging him to come home. He comes home. Again, there's no big dramatic thing. He asks where the children are. And he's pretty much told they're in the garden. And he's mumbling in the garden. So he goes looking for them. And Colin, again, they're playing blind man's buff. Colin comes out, runs into his father, realizes who he is. Archibald Craven is shocked because his helpless child that he used to sneak in on basically see when he was sleeping, is a perfectly healthy, walking, laughing young boy. Stands perfectly straight. So no arch of the back at all. His father has arched shoulders. It's more like he has he's not a hunchback. He just has really big shoulders that are hunched over. He doesn't have a bump on his back in the book at all. That's not how Mary describes it. So Colin sees his father, brings him in. His father basically says, bring me into the garden. And they bring him into the garden, and he sits down under the tree, and Colin tells him everything that's happened. He tells the whole big story while walking around, and his father's just kind of laughing and happy and just completely shocked. And then it ends with Ben Witherspot has gone back to the house. Now he knows everything that's going on. He gets a beer. He rarely comes to the house, and they ask him what on earth is going on. He's like, you'll see. And he watches the servants be completely shocked when Colin and his father come walking up to the house. Because Colin's pretty like, let's go up to the house. He's like, I'm never sitting in that chair again, because normally he'd been pretending that he couldn't walk. And that's how the book ends. The book doesn't end with some dramatic thing with Mary. In fact, you don't really see much after of Mary after I think they go out that day. So she's not there. She could be, but it's not mentioned because they're paying more. Again, the servants are paying more attention to the fact that the sickly little spoiled boy is walking and perfectly healthy. So that's what they're staring at. The point of the story, again, there's no real villain. In the film, they put in that villain. They make Medlock and the nurses and the doctor villains. In the story, they're not in the book. The villain is the children themselves. The entire point of the story, and they make it very, very clear with this simple phrase, where you tend of rose, my lad, a thistle cannot grow. And it explains what this means. That as long as Mary was depressed and being miserable and disliking people and thinking about the cold and how she was alone, she was a sickly, unhappy young girl with, her hair is blonde in the book, and it's just kind of a limpy blonde hair. And she looks sickly yellow because she's depressed and not happy, and she has bad digestion. And when she starts thinking about happy things like gardens and flowers and Dickon and the moors and magic, she changes into a happy, healthy, thick blonde hair, normal looking young girl. The same with Colin. As long as he's thinking about how miserable he is, how alone he is, that he has a hump on his back, that he's going to die, and depressing things, he's a sickly, spoiled, obnoxious boy. When he starts thinking of gardens and magic and little animals and flowers and spring, he starts walking and smiling and gaining weight, and he becomes happy. And that is the point. That is the entire point of the story, that you can be your own worst enemy. Now, this is not, this was written in the early 1900s. So this is not a modern critique on mental illness. These children are of the upper class of British society. They do not have anything to worry about financially at all. I mean, yeah, Mary's father was had a high position in the military. They were wealthy. I mean, Craven owns a giant estate that seems to be in one piece. They don't really have financial worries at this point in time. So, and yes, they were slightly depressed 10-year-olds who became better because they stopped having depressing thoughts. This is not a critique on modern mental illness. I suffered from modern mental illness. It's not about whether or not you have a good life or not, a lot of the times. It's a chemical imbalance of the brain. That's not the point of the story. These are 10-year-olds living in Edwardian England. It's a fantasy story on how these children were thinking bad thoughts, and when they started getting outside and playing and engaging with other children and not being cooped up inside and stuck inside their heads, they became happier. Now, can this be part of helping treat mental illness? Yes. But in the real world, not in a fictional, again, Edwardian England, there's more to it. So that's not the point of this book. So not a critique on mental illness. And in fact, again, when this book was written, mental illness was still, it was still in its infancy. So the author would not have much of a clue about this. This is a children's story about essentially two children coming of age and learning to be healthier and enjoying life and gardens and not being selfish and self-absorbed and angry, violent, little spoiled children. So that is the point. That is what this is about. This is a children's book. The film is the same. The film, I kind of get that they need to do a villain, but they really don't. That's what I dislike. When I rewatched this film, particularly after rereading the book, I always dislike this. And that weird thing of making, they do a lot of these bizarre flashbacks with Lilith and in the garden that's not in the book. It makes it very dreamy and very, very weird. And them wandering around the house and looking at different things. And again, making Medlock evil and locking them in. I don't know, he wanted to give Maggie Smith something more to do, but I think it discredits the actress who plays Mrs. Medlock in this film, which is one of my favorite English actresses, damn Maggie Smith. You're familiar with her from Minerva McGonagall in the Harry Potter series. Probably one of the best thing about those films was Maggie Smith. But again, she's brilliant in this. So, all the acting is good in this. This is a good film. This is not a bad film. I'm more critiquing its difference on the book. I kind of like the ending a little bit more because you get more of Mary's more involved. That's one thing I do like. Mary's more involved at the end of this film. And it gives that ending of how things are happier. It's not just Colin and his father walking in. But again, that whole, not to mention the medical stuff. The medical stuff is a little weird. Is it period accurate? Yes. Does it make sense for the story? No. Again, it's an adaptation issue. They're adding more nonsense that doesn't need to be there. Because they do talk to him about it. They do think he's getting flushed and his legs may be swollen, but they don't do anything about it because Colin says no. And again, they know there's nothing actually wrong with him. They had a specialist down from London who made it perfectly clear. The other thing I don't know if they mentioned this in the film. In the book, his doctor is his cousin and will inherit if Colin dies. So when Colin, he brings this up in the book, that it's possible that the doctor technically wants him to die because the doctor does not have a lot of money. And if Colin and his father die, he'll get everything because he's the next male relative. So, though who knows what would have happened to Mary in this case. But of course, Colin wasn't thinking about that because Mary didn't exist in his world until he was 10. So, the other thing about making them the sisters twins, again, that turns into the weird dreamy aspect. It's very, very funny. And it makes no sense. It doesn't add or subtract from the world. And then the whole die in an earthquake. I suppose it's easier, but cholera is a thing. I mean, they died of disease, which usually in the book they would have been well known, but it dumbs it down for the audience. It's like they get sick. Children, I'm saying, it's like cholera. They wouldn't necessarily know what it meant, but one, it could be explained. You could do some sort of thing. People basically are dying of cholera. Hopefully most children understand this. I'm pretty sure it was common in basic education classes that it was a disease that killed people a lot during this time period, and there was a cholera outbreak in India at the time. So the earthquake thing seems really, really stupid. So, I'm trying to think if there's... Hopefully my child. Alright, so I'm going to check on my child. So that's going to be it for this review. Great film, very much a family film. Fantastic book, highly recommend both. So if you like this review, like and subscribe. I have a lot of book reviews, children's book reviews, picture book reviews, all sorts of stuff, very family friendly. My films vary. Sometimes I do stuff that I like that's a little bit more in the upper teens adult range, but I have plenty of kids stuff. I do a sprinkling of travel stuff, a sprinkling of non-religious, also known as secular homeschooling stuff here and there. And I have a bunch more planned. So like and subscribe, see what I've got, and see what I have coming. Thank you.